Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual Bob Lucid Memorial Fiction Program sponsored by the Kelly Writers House. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Amir Ahmadi Arian for an event hosted by our very own Fatemeh Shams. Our Bob Lucid program celebrates contemporary fiction and contemporary fiction writers, all in honor of Bob Lucid, who helped imagine what I think of as the community-focused ethos of Writers House. We are delighted to honor Bob's memory each year through a fiction program that allows people to come together, with this year virtually, to think about and discuss great fiction writing. If you want to hear about future Writers House events, including our annual fiction program, I hope you'll sign our virtual guest book, which should appear in the YouTube chat. And also, if you have questions during today's program, you are most welcome to write those in the YouTube chat as well. We'll have a staff member, Ali Katz, who will bring your questions over into our Zoom discussion. And towards the end, there will be time for your questions to be addressed. So probably the last 10 or 15 minutes of this event. So don't be shy. We do want to hear from you. We're excited that this conversation can happen. Before I turn this over to Fatemeh to get us going, I want to say a word about her. She is, as many of you know, a poet, a translator, and a literary scholar, and she teaches right here at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. We have been so very lucky here at Writers House to be a place that she contributes with her energy, her ideas, and what I'd call her enthusiasm. She's hosted a number of events here at Writers House, all with great care and great rigor. There's always good conversation. And for sure, it's always with an eye toward the ways literature and culture and politics intersect and how they can inform us. Literature is something to tell us, has something to tell us about how we live, how we could live, how we might want to conceive the world. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your generous words. Really, it's an honor, it's a privilege to be able to collaborate with Kelly Writers House in the past 4 years that I have joined University of Pennsylvania. I'm really grateful to you, to Ali, to Zach, to Al Filris, everyone at the Kelly Writers House, to have really been such a great source of support and inspiration for the young scholars and for talented artists and writers and poets. So it's a pleasure to be here, and also it's an honor to be hosting this program with our wonderful guest today, Amir Ahmadi Arian, who has kindly accepted to join us for this online event. As much as we love to have him, to host him at the University of Pennsylvania to celebrate his excellent work of fiction that has recently been published by HarperCollins. We had to cancel everything like many other events, but I was keen on keep the conversation going. So thank you, Amir, for joining us from New York. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Absolutely, thank you for having me, and thanks to folks who organized this event. I really appreciate it. You know, in this weird times, you guys just putting effort into putting these events together. Yeah, we're really grateful to you.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add a very quick note that this event is part of the seminar that I'm teaching this semester under the title of Introduction to Persian Novel. So there is a pedagogical aspect into the conversation that we will be having today. My students are watching this program, and we will have a seminar after this, a conversation followed by this conversation talking about your work, Amir. So it's very, very wonderful and helpful that you accepted to join this conversation, since we already read your novel as part of the course as well. So let me start with a very quick introduction to you and your work before diving into the conversation. So Amir Ahmadi Arian started out as a journalist in Iran in 2000 and has since published a collection of stories, a nonfiction book, and 2 novels in Persian. He also translated from English to Persian novels by E.L. Doctorow, Paul Auster, P.D. James, and Cormac McCarthy. Since leaving Iran in 2011 to complete a PhD in comparative literature at the University of Queensland, Australia, he has published short stories and essays in Michigan Quarterly Review, Guernica, the New York Times, The Guardian, and I will add to this list also the Paris Review. He currently lives in New York, where he earned an MFA in the NYU Creative Writing Program as the Axinn Foundation E.L. Doctorow Fellowship recipient, and he also teaches literature and creative writing at CUNY City College. Amir, I know you well before the publication of And Then Fish Swallowed Him, and even well before I actually had met you here in the United States in 2017. I got to know you through your works of translation, and also your, you as a columnist in newspapers in Iran. You have written a wonderful book about this also in Persian. So my first question, I thought, would be something relevant to this sort of, knowing you as a translator, literary translator. And as I just listed, the translations that you have done from English to Persian, my question is that how did the 2 experiences of being a literary translator and a novelist intertwined? And how did translation, if in any way, help you with your own creative writing?
Yeah, I got into translation primarily for financial reasons, to be honest. Yeah, it's not, it was never my first choice. And I never really loved it either. Iran is a kind of a strange place, in the sense that the readership in Iran prefers translated books to authored books, right? So if you are a fiction writer in Iran, chances are you'll sell far fewer books than like a, I don't know, mediocre translated like American or British mediocre translated author, right? So and since writing was pretty much the only thing I knew how to do, I needed to kind of be versatile and do different things in order to make ends meet. So that's how I got into translation. But I'm glad I did as a writer, because when you translate a book, it's a totally different experience from reading it. Obviously, you spend so much time with just one text, sometimes a couple of years, to render it into a different language. And in this process, not only you get to really familiarize yourself with like nooks and crannies, with like the details of the language you're translating from, all the things, sentence structures, word choices, how to kind of construct the voice, and so on. All the things that will help you as a fiction writer later. Not only you get to know a lot about that, but you also, this is like you get into a process of reverse engineering a novel when you translate it, right? So when you see a book, this is, the final product is like, looking at a car. There are like thousands of pieces in a car that you cannot, tell apart. So the car, you buy a car as a whole, just as you buy a book as a whole. and there are as many pieces going into a book, as there are going into a car, but you don't really notice them as as a reader. So the act of translation is sort of taking apart a book, just as a mechanic takes apart a car and looks inside it and distinguishes different pieces and learns so much about how a car works. In the same fashion, when you translate a book, you get to really take it apart, separate the pieces and look at them, individually, and learn so much about how they were put together in the first place. So yeah, there are lots of lessons to learn for a writer from translation. So I encourage anyone who knows more than one language, even if not for and wants to be a writer, right? Even if not for the sake of publishing, just as a sort of a practice, do translate. That really kind of helps you learn a lot about the process of writing. Yeah.
Do you still translate?
No, I'm retired as a translator. Yeah.
Great. And just to continue on that, in your novel, Then the Fish Swallowed Him, you also seem to have an eye on this translation game, in the sense that there are occasions that you leave the reader, the non-Persian reader, with words that are not translated.
Yeah.
A good example of that is the word zulm. We had a conversation about this before, that why you decided to not translate this certain term. And if you can elaborate on that, and also if there were any other terms and words that you initially actually left untranslated, and then at the final stage you decided to actually get them translated. And if there were terms, what were those terms?
Yeah.
Why did you translate them?
It's very tricky, this is a book that is set in Iran, right? And everybody, all the characters in it speak in Persian, right? But you're telling, I mean, supposedly they're fictional, but you're telling their story in English, right? It's a language that they don't speak in. So you got to walk a really fine line. You don't want to lose your English reader, obviously, so you don't really kind of pepper the text with Persian words or everything that emphasizes the language, right? That emphasizes that this is not your language, right? This is a different language. You don't want to do that, but at the same time, you don't want to kind of, make them too comfortable, because part of the experience of reading about a different culture is the sense of distance, is the, communicating the notion that there's a gap between you, the reader, and the people of the book, people in the book, and is not easily, it's basically insurmountable obstacle. You cannot just jump over it and assume you're in a different world, right? So you got to be really careful with translation, especially when you translate dialogue. Sometimes some people play with like the grammar. They write English in a kind of a weird grammar, not exactly accurate, but not false either. There's some sort of an estrangement, element of strangeness sort of injected into the grammar. That's one way of kind of communicating that these people are not speaking English in the world of the book. Or you can bring in like words from that other language, which is what I did. Like occasionally there are terms that kind of show up in the dialogue that is otherwise written in English, and there are words in Persian. These are basically signals to the reader, right? They're like reminders, frequent reminders that this is a different language. So then we come to the question of how to pick those words. Which words you want to leave there in Persian, which ones you translate or not. For this book, there were certain terms that just basically were not translatable, right? So that the word zulm that comes in the beginning of the book, in the first chapter that you brought up, is definitely one of them. The word zulm, roughly means like, tyranny or abuse, or, in that kind of territory. It really doesn't mean any of those, because it has a very kind of strong theological connotation that no English word conveys, or at least no English word that I managed to find. Um, Zolm basically means, so the word, God has designed the world in a certain way, and people have different places in it. But if you interfere with the divine order, then you commit Zolm. So this is, a sin both against people and against God, right? And that's a concept that I couldn't find in English, right? An equivalent in English for that. So I leave it there in Persian. It's actually Arabic word, but it's shared in Persian. And so I leave it there untranslated, and I quote some verses from the Quran in which the word zulm plays a really central role. Yeah, so there was another passage, the ones that I didn't translate, is in their interrogation, and Eunice is in the characters in the interrogation room and looks at the sort of the armchair, the handle of the chair in front of him, and sees that there's like a carving of 3 letters, Aleph, Ain, and Te. Okay, but the rest of it is removed because they scrub that surface frequently, so prisoners could not leave messages for each other. So then he starts thinking about what it could have been. Was it like e'temad, e'teraz, e'tekaf? He goes through like a list of words that start with these 3 letters, and eventually he decides that this is e'temad, right? Which is trust. Mm-hmm. And so he decides that the person before him wrote this word here as a message that never trust your interrogator, right? Mm-hmm. So, but that kind of went a little too far, so I removed that passage. That's an example of not doing that.
Yeah. Very interesting. And since we are on this sort of translation and not translation of words such as, for example, zulm, that you mentioned that it has a Quranic connotation. You took it. We also see both from the title of the work, and it's a work of allegory, of course. Allegorical sort of work that you draw on the stories of Quran and Bible in order to pull off your story. And you also put words in the mouth of certain characters in the book where they're, drawing on the Quranic statements and verses in order to, sort of develop their own argument or their own position. So my question is, why did you choose? And this is actually a question that one of my students also asked, Yusuf also asked, that you use this Quranic allegory, this biblical allegory, in order to tell the story of a man who is an atheist, who doesn't believe in God. But also to sort of elaborate on that, I would also like to ask that the way in which you put the words, those sort of words that have Quranic or religious connotations in the mouth of certain characters and who are not affiliated with the government. How did you go about religion in this book? And if you can elaborate on the allegory as well, that would be great.
Well, the allegory is the story of Eunice or Jonah. So the prophet kind of expelled from his community, then thrown into the sea, and the whale in the Quran, big fish in the Bible, swallows him, and he spends some time in the belly of the fish or whale, and then he's kind of coughed out onto the shore, right? So this journey is almost mirrors the journey of a lot of people who end up in solitary confinement for political reasons, right? There's someone kind of pulled away from the community for whatever reason, usually for unjustifiable reasons. In the context of Iran, I'm talking. So they're dragged away from their communities. they're kind of thrown into the solitary confinement, which is pretty similar to being stuck inside like the belly of a monster. Uh, it's it's just a dark, small place, barely bigger than your own body, and there's nothing fun happening in there. So, and then in the end, leaving that stomach, being back onto the shore, is kind of similar to being released from the prison. So I thought that allegory would work. Why I chose it, I don't look at the Quran or the Bible as texts that are written for people of belief necessarily. I look at them as like universal text of very high quality of storytelling, right? There's a reason that of all like millions upon millions of stories that were told before, these few stuck. They touch something, some chord deep inside, like the human psyche, human mind, and they get to speak to people from a variety of backgrounds in various places over time. They are in those stories kind of travel from one era to another, and really survive the changes, the vagaries of every human era. So there's a certain power to biblical stories, to stories of the scripture that is hard to find elsewhere, right? And they're all, they have this inexhaustible capacity to produce literature. And I'm obviously not the first one who does that. You just go back in time, and a lot of novelists over time, they basically modernized, or if you like, updated biblical stories. It's like an endless list from Thomas Mann, William Faulkner. I don't know. I just off the top of my head, there are many of them also elsewhere in the world as well. And yeah, so that's how I read those texts. Actually, I read them as probably some of the most amazing and powerful stories that human mind has ever created. Depending what you believe, or you can kind of find like a oracular source for them. So that's kind of my take on that. About the question of Islam in this work, so there is a kind of common belief. The name Iran, just accompanies so many misunderstandings that you can't really I don't even know where to begin to dispel them. But one of them is the idea, the commonplace idea about how Islam works in that society, right? So if you watch the news, the main impression you will get is that, so there's a dichotomy there. There is a government on one side, a bunch of zealots, like fundamentalists, and they're kind of ruthlessly capture and torture everyone and put them to jail and so on. Then there's on the other side this population of kind of West-loving seculars who are just trapped there, right? And they are subjugated to the whims and desires of that ruthless government, which couldn't be further from truth. The fact of the matter is that if you actually look at the way the government works in Iran, you'll be hard pressed to find anything Islamic in that process, right? It's a very well-oiled oppression machine, bureaucracy, and they do bureaucracy pretty well. There's really no sign of any sort of belief in like an afterlife or any kind of moral hindrance in the mind of people who are running that system. They commit zulm on a daily basis, in the exact sense that I used just a few minutes ago. And basically everything they do is in contradiction with the most part of the Quran and like the teachings of Islam. Or you could argue for that, but that's what I believe. And then on the other side, the people who actually stand up to that system, right? I mean, Iran is like a 90% Shia population. The vast majority of people are Muslims there. And all of them, I don't really know the number, but my guess is that, maybe 60% of them are practicing Muslim who, really like genuinely believe in the principles of Shiism, like the God and Prophet and 12 Imam and so on. And so a lot of the resistance that you see against that system, that kind of brutal system, is actually done by these, some of them devout Muslims, right? And they really kind of follow, actually, they are, those who kind of follow what you can call like the liberation theology of Islam, to borrow from Christianity, that has a very strong presence in the Middle East, in general, and Iran in particular. So that's basically what you see in the book comes from this, understanding of the religious dynamics in Iran. The guy who gives the speech in the beginning of the book, right? The kind of old school union fighter. He is a devout Muslim. He quotes the Quran. He talks about Zulm in details. It almost sounds like a theologian. And then the interrogator, who's like deeply embedded in the system and kind of represents the government, there's nothing like Islamic in his words or his actions. And so, yeah, that was like a way of kind of addressing that misunderstanding, or what I take to be a misunderstanding in the book.
Thank you. That's terrific. Actually, as you were talking, I was also thinking about how really masterfully you break away from this binary of evil versus angelic, or godly versus godless, in the book, and sort of complicate that image of Iran and also the prison system itself, which you basically, I think, show it very vividly, that how much of a bureaucratic system this prison is. And I know that you in the book you passingly mentioned Foucault, and also in a couple of interviews you mentioned that Discipline and Punish has been, for example, a book that has been influential for you. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. How did you manage to give such a vivid and detailed description of the solitary confinement in particular, and also the prison system as a whole, like from the moment that eunice enters the building, and in connection to the previous question also, there are too many parentheses in this question, but since they're all interconnected, I think it would be great if we also take a look at page 43 together, since we talked about this allegory, the biblical allegory of the story of Eunice or Jonah, where the moment where Eunice enters the prison, the gate opens. If we can read that part, and then following that, if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on how did you come up with this extremely detailed and vivid, and I would like to also say accurate, but maybe you can also elaborate on that, explanation and expression of this prison as a bureaucratic system, which is utterly modern, right?
Yeah.
Very different from the image, that the sort of the outsider's image of Iran and its prison system.
Yeah. So do you want me to read this page?
Yes, please. Page 43, from where my heart pounded.
Okay.
I think, or a little bit further down. Yeah, one of the guards pushed me, maybe.
Yeah, I can read from my heart pounded.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the second paragraph on page 43. My heart pounded. In Tehran, few things impress people more than someone who could say he had been to heaven. Soon I would have a story of my own. I took a few deep breaths and waited for the gate to open. On TV, I had seen footage of this moment, the gate yawning like the mouth of an ancient beast to swallow a new victim. My turn had arrived. It was disappointing to be blindfolded, but at least I could hear the noise. One of the guards pushed me. I walked up to the gate. It opened. I heard not the sonorous groan I had anticipated, but a pathetic creak. It sounded like the rusted hinges of a toilet door. Step over the sill, the guard told me. My shoulders bumped into a frame. The gate hadn't opened at all. Instead, I passed through a narrow door built into the larger entrance. I got into Evan the way I would enter a grocery store.
Fantastic. I got into Evan the way I would enter a grocery store. And like a couple of lines up there, you just read that, it felt like an ancient beast to swallow a new victim. You just, all these images and descriptions that, constantly really attack the mind of the reader and doesn't let the reader breathe. That's why I call this word breathtaking in terms of imagery.
Thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, so it took a lot of research, obviously, writing this book, because I've never, fortunately, I've never been in that prison, right? Never spent time there. But the thing is, if you live in Iran and you're involved in politics on one way or the other, which I was, chances are that you are surrounded with people who spend time in that place. So, which was the case, for me. So I did read a lot, like I read a lot of memoirs and just accounts of time in Evan from mostly post-revolution, because it was a pretty different place after '79. So I drew a lot on those accounts and experiences, and I kind of called from them for this book. But I wouldn't have been able to write this book without the personal testimonies that I listened to, right? So I talked to maybe about a dozen people, most of them my friends, some of them very, very close friends, who have been in solitary confinement, in Evan, and they, at like different degrees of generosity, they share their experiences with me. I mean, generosity, I mean, because for a lot of them, it was too hard to talk about, not that they didn't want to share anything. And yeah, so just when you listen to like a firsthand account, like a first-person narrative of an experience like that, it's totally different from reading about it in a memoir or a journalistic account. So that yeah, like you mentioned Doctorow's name. He has a famous quote that history. He was asked about the difference between historian and novelist, right? He says the historian tells you what happened, the novelist tells you what it felt like. And that's that difference holds for reading the accounts of time in solitary confinement and listening to people who were there, right? You get to know what it felt like only when you talk actually to like a human being, right, who was there. So from like the ups and downs in their voices, from the way they sort of articulate their experiences, from all the pauses and hesitation, where they stumble, where they like talk fast, all of those, when you listen to that, you kind of absorb that almost subconsciously, and that really comes as a tremendous help when you try to create a character who's been there, because as a novelist, I wanted to communicate how it felt like, not just what happened. Right. So I owe so much to those people. I mean, a couple of them I mentioned their names in the acknowledgement page at the end of this book, but most of them I couldn't because they live in Iran, and it would have been a security hazard for them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, interviewing political prisoners is one thing. I mean, ex-political prisoners, and sort of them talking about those experiences in such vivid details is something else. I think it's really something that is admirable for those who agreed to do that.
Yeah, especially the solitary because, you know, most people were, you know, they talked about the interrogation fairly easily and extensively, right? And they, you know, people really have develop a really good memory when they are in prison. When they come out, you know, like most instances of like intense, intensity in life, the memory kind of comes alive. And so, yeah, when it came to recounting what happened in the interrogation room, you know, what took place between them and interrogator, what did they say to each other, and so on. They talked fairly easily about that. It didn't really need to push anyone. And there were lots of funny moments, actually. They remembered and recounted. A lot of them were really, you know, eager to kind of mimic the accent of the interrogator, that talked in their accents for some reason. And yeah, that was the easier part. But when it came to solitary confinement, the time they had to spend on their own in that cage, that was tough. Only a few people really, talked about it, and some of them didn't say anything at all. Some of them spoke very briefly. Some started, you know, speaking, then they just cut it off and, you know, said they couldn't go on. So yeah, the time in solitary is tough to talk about. I mean, I've never been there, so I'm just, you know, talking according to what I saw and what I heard. But it sounds very sort of difficult to articulate when you're out of that situation.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I was gonna say that especially the solitary chapters in this book, I think maybe about like 100 pages of it is set in the cell. It would have been impossible to write without those accounts, without talking to those folks. And yeah, solitary is not something you can kind of imagine as a writer. You know, it defies imagination, and you really need to listen to someone who has been there, if you're lucky, and they can put it to words.
And it also, solitary confinement, I mean, I also had immediate family members who spent time in solitary confinement, and I have many friends like you. For the most part, they don't want to talk about it. And sometimes when they do talk about it, their memory is completely shattered. So they have troubles remembering what happened and how the time passed. And sometimes even they lose the sense of time because for sort of lengthier period when they're there under pressure to give answers to certain questions or to confess to things they haven't done, they're usually put under the pressure of simply just being left in the solitary confinement cell and not being checked on with anyone.
And the ceiling lamp is always on, so you can't you're not able to like tell the difference between day and night, which is like a form of torture. Yeah, and I mean, I really heard things I never even thought about. Like, well, someone told me that after a few days, he kind of lost language. He lost the words. He would, you know, look at like the wall or table or, you know, like toilet, and he's just trying to remember what the word for that was, right? Yeah, the mind goes to really strange places.
So on that note, I think there is a passage in your book where you talk about or rather describe Eunice's state of mind and existence in the solitary confinement when he starts interacting with a bug, with an insect.
Oh, with a fly, yeah.
Or with a fly. I was wondering if we can go through that together, and maybe on that note, you can also explain, okay, part of it was that you were listening to all these accounts and taking notes and sort of going back to them. And what other mechanisms as a writer did you use in order to make this experience imaginable for your audience, for your readers? And I'm curious, just as a matter of fact, whether this interaction with fly is something that you came up with, or this is an inspiration. Did it come from one of the interviews you had?
Yeah, so someone talked to me about watching ants. Actually heard it from several people. There's like an obsession with other kind of living creatures. If you come across them in the cell, you feel like a bond, almost a sense of alliance with them. And they're usually, like insects, is a cockroach, an ant, or fly or something. And so this guy was there was like a little hole in the wall, and ants would kind of go in and out of that. And he would spend hours every day watching that, just the movement of ants kind of along the wall into the hole and out and so on. So yeah, that was basically the inspiration for this passage. This is so Eunice is in solitary confinement, and he's been beaten up before that, so he's in severe pain, especially in his knee. And then a fly somehow makes it into his cell, and yeah, he kind of obsessively follows the fly around and tries to talk to it. And yeah, so yeah, that's page 107. So yeah, I don't know. Actually, after writing this book, I didn't think much about it. But after that, I been reading on sort of animals in literature, and I realized that they actually show up in similar instances a lot, not just in prison, but every time you have someone who's trampled upon, who's like severely subjugated and put in a really weak position. And in those moments, they develop like a bond with animals. There's like a sympathy is generated between them and animals in their surroundings. Recently, I actually was reading a really excellent book called "Being Property Once Myself" by Joshua Bennett. And he talks about the different animals in a few books written by Black American authors over time. The book starts with a quote by Frederick Douglass, where he says that actually, like the opening of that memoir is, I'm paraphrasing, is that like the age of a slave as irrelevant to his experience as the age of a horse or something like that, right? And he notices that in that literature over time, in like slavery accounts, like first person accounts during slavery, then later on in fiction of major American authors like Richard Wright and Toni Morrison, he notices that there is a special place for animals, right, in across their work, across this corpus. And they show up in similar ways. They, usually the person who's enslaved or in a really kind of difficult situation, they form an alliance, like forge a kinship with an animal, right? And that sort of helps them through a situation, gives them strength of mind, something like that. So yeah, I didn't think about it while writing this book, but recently I'm becoming more and more aware of this bond. Even in families, I've seen in like a few families that have maybe more than 3-4 kids, I've noticed that the youngest kid is the animal lover, right? In those families, maybe they get bullied the most, so they turn to animals as their
It's
friends.
also the good old example of Rostam or Rakhsh in the Shahnameh, for example, that in positions like during the 7th trials, Rostam is literally being saved by Rakhsh.
Yeah, they're very close.
Yeah.
It's all over Shahnameh. There's a worm somewhere. That plays a really, there are a bunch of animals. Haunting is all, of course, a major element of that book. And in Masnavi, in Rumi's Masnavi also, they're all over the place.
Yeah.
And
the whole fable allegory of the Mantaroter, the conference of the birds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and I would love if you can read that part, because I think it also shows how it's a fascinating part. It's also it shows that Eunice is literally on the borderline of going mad, right? It's like on the verge of what could be considered as madness.
Yeah.
In
It's gonna get much worse though.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So I'm on page 107. And yeah, as I said, this is early in solitary, where he sees a fly in his cell. Then I saw a fly. The insect, fresh from the free world, was sitting on a slat in front of the open window, rubbing its feelers together. It seemed to be deciding whether to come inside or turn around and fly back out. Its body made a dot on the narrow strip of light between the window slats. The position of its black shadow created the illusion that the edges of the slats bent in towards themselves and made the fly look bigger than it really was. It eventually made up its mind and launched itself into the cell. It maneuvered around briefly, took note of the walls and the ceiling, and alighted back on the slat. Please stay a little longer. The words left my mouth before I had even thought of uttering them. The fly stopped rubbing its legs, like it was weighing my offer. Then it tiptoed to the side of the slat and stood in profile to me. I came to my knees and followed its moves closely. The fly flew into the room again. It floated straight toward me, circled above my head, drifted away, spiraled down, looped back around, and hovered near my face. I closed my eyes and listened with pleasure to its delicate, ear-stroking buzz. Then the fly approached the window, but pulled back quickly. It made another turn around the cell and paused over the toilet bowl, carved out short circles in the air, lowered altitude as meticulously as a helicopter carrying wounded soldiers, and landed on the vomit smear. It jabbed its proboscis into the dry vomit and began to feast. Yeah, I stopped there. It goes on for a few more pages, and yeah.
And this part, as you were reading it and I was listening to you, I know that you describe this work, you talk about this novel in different interviews as a perfectly realistic novel. And you've been asked this question whether you consider this as a dystopian novel, and your answer to that question has been negative. I was wondering if you see a perfectly realistic novel sort of as a versus a perfectly dystopian novel as a sort of a binary, or you think that they can intersect, and then I will ask the next question.
I think it really depends on the context. This reads dystopian in American context because very few people are put through this kind of ordeal here, right? So it does feel like, like an authoritarian. It's as if, like a dictator took over America, and I don't know, 20, 30 years from now, and they installed like this regime of terror and, put just people to jail for just showing up at a strike or something, right? So in the American context, it can be read as dystopian. It didn't even occur to me when the book came out. And when I got asked this question constantly, or this like comparisons with 1984 and this like famous dystopian kind of canonical Western novels, then I noticed the difference, right? That in this context, it does actually read like a novel from like a dark future, or like a different plane of reality. But this is a daily occurrence in Iran, right? That no one, no Iranian reader would be even surprised at this. This is actually not the worst thing that can happen to you if you show up in a strike, right? It gets beaten up pretty mildly by standards of Iran. They're just a bunch of slaps and like a bunch of kicks in his ass and things like that. Yeah, the torture and solitary. I mean, he's there for only like a month. Then he kind of comes clean and confesses, and then he goes to the prison with other prisoners. So yeah, people go through much more than this for something much less significant than Eunice does in this book, which is joining a strike in that country. It can be even like you just happen to be walking by a strike like that without even being involved in that, and you get kind of swept up, lumped in with the crowd, and you just go to this prison, and then like you're stuck in this Kafkaesque situation that you have no way of proving your innocence or showing your innocence. And yeah, just because of being at the wrong time in the wrong place, you might be in jail for like 10 years. I'm not exaggerating. Again, I know this is
I agree.
No, but I mean, because our audience is like mostly
Oh, yeah.
not Iranian. I'm just saying that what I said is not an exaggeration at all, as absurd and terrifying as it sounds, right? So yeah, that's the difference. I was in my mind, I was writing a realistic account of what happens to like a bus driver, an average bus driver who gets involved in politics. And again, I should emphasize that most of them went through much worse than this. And yeah, but in a different context, in a country like here, and like most of kind of Western European countries, it either belongs to the far past or like a imagined dark future, but it's not realistic.
Right. And exactly as you were talking, I was and as I read this novel so far twice, it's really much closer to the literature of absurd and sort of Kafkaesque
Yeah.
account of reality rather than Orwellian, I would say. I mean, I can see why people think and sort of compare it with Orwell's 1984 or Fahrenheit. But I personally think it's more like, even like the character of Eunice, although you mentioned in different interviews that since you were a youngster, you fell in love with Mark Twain and you read, Steinbeck and Doctorow and all these other, American writers. But it seems to me that the character of Eunice is very much like characters of Camus and Kafka's stories rather than any of those works.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, it is Kafkaesque in the sense that like bureaucracy is probably the protagonist of this book. In the same fashion that it is in like the trial or the castle. Yeah, and this character also, I think you're right. This is a like very kind of I would say French like existentialist character. This is someone kind of stripped of humanity, and also stripped of like emotions. He doesn't really know how to respond to the world, which is interesting. When the book was on submission, a lot of the rejections that I got from American editors was about the character, right? They thought that he is just too passive. He's just there, and things happen to
These
him.
are American publishers, right?
Yeah, the American editors, yeah. And so they were looking for a more kind of proactive, involved sort of character. But we sold the French rights in like 5 minutes. Yeah, it was very, very, very quickly. Yeah, the
Interesting.
French publishers were more interested in this book. And when you look at the American literary canon, I don't know, from Moby Dick all the way to like people you mentioned, Mark Twain, even like Edith Wharton, Faulkner, Hemingway, and so on. If you actually look at the characters like Captain Ahab, Huckleberry Finn, Isabel Archer, for instance, in Henry James, you see that they are very active and almost and involved, right? You don't really see like any kind of passive in a sort of Camus stranger sort of character in American fiction, or if you see them, they're not like part of like the so-called, quote unquote canon of American literature. Whereas that's not the case, definitely, in like the French literature. If anything, it's more like the opposite of that. Yeah, so it's probably also the result of, growing up reading so much of French literature, because that was the thing that was being, translated the most in the 80s and 70s when I was a kid and reading books.
And on that note, actually, since we are on Eunice and his character, one of my students, Keely, had a question, and this is related to the character of Eunice and the story of Jonah. And her question is that what came first, the idea to use the story of Jonah or Eunice as an intertextual controlling metaphor, or the story of the bus driver itself?
No, it's definitely the story of bus driver. This novel has been with me since maybe 2005. And the first chapter of this book, the strike scene in a bus terminal in west of Tehran, is actually based on a real event. And it didn't happen in the way that I describe it in the book, but there was a big strike at the time, 2004, in that part of the city. And and at the time, again, buses were like the main means of transportation in Tehran, right? So if buses stopped working, then the city would have, kind of gone apocalyptic, which is what happened for a few days.
Right.
So I happened to live in that part of Tehran at the time and witnessed this firsthand. Also, getting stuck in traffic and seeing how the city just grew chaotic, so quickly. So one thing that I really noticed there was the power of workers' union, which I was totally oblivious to before those days. And I had no idea that, just by a simple strike, I mean, it's not simple, just by a strike, organizing a strike, workers can basically, shut down a city. Right. So in this case, it was bus drivers, but I don't know if like bakers did the same thing, the same sort of chaos would have ensued. So that kind of stuck with me. And I, after that, I read more about the history of, like union struggle in Iran since the constitutional revolution in 1906. I kind of talked to more people about it, and so this has been with me. I mean, it's not like my field. I've never written or done anything about it, but it has always been in the back of my mind all these years. And so finally, I started writing about it. 2016, I started this novel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's the first account, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't read any other novel about Iran where they we know ins and outs of the union's activities, what they read, the books that they read, the kind of events that they have. And I think in that respect, this book is also pretty informative and interesting. And my question is that did you actually attend those meetings, or did you just hear it from the members of the union?
No, I just hear them from the members. I mean, I started writing when I was out of Iran, so I didn't do any kind of field work for research. All of it was through conversation and reading. So yeah, I managed to, contact a few members of the union who were, who lived in exile after, spending time in prison. And yeah, through them, I got, guided to different pamphlets and books about this history. And yeah, they told me about their meetings and what they did. Another thing is like so there are bus drivers in this novel, reading like novels and Foucault and, it's like highbrow philosophers, Western philosophers. I didn't make up any of that. I just heard all of it. They actually.
Eunice loves, for example, the wretched of the earth.
Yeah. So that's another thing that I had no idea about. That there's union workers who were involved in those strikes. They're very well read and they're very knowledgeable and they know exactly what they were doing. So yeah, they had these reading groups. They would read, like political theory, like philosophy, things that they sort of deemed relevant to their work and their struggle, and they spent time discussing them. Yeah, they're probably a lot of them, more knowledgeable than a lot of like intellectuals over there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and we start actually receiving questions and sort of comments from YouTube that I will incorporate into our conversation in a minute. But I also, well, since we are on the character of Eunice, I also have a couple of questions without like, spoiling the novel for the readers, for the future readers. Is that, in one of your interviews, you mentioned that, you always were worried that this work, when it came out, is a highly masculine novel. And particularly because of the large chunk of the work happens basically around the character of the interrogator and Eunice, and, his sort of recollections of the past. But I think Eunice in particular is the one who is ripped off his masculinity very much, and nothing of his character as a masculine sort of character so comes across even. Maybe the only part that even the sort of the love affair that he has with with the wife of his best friend, I think what we get out of that sort of relationship, which is sort of Homa going about her life and he being left on his own, sort of, not getting anything out of that relationship, but disregard. And so I was wondering if when you were writing about Eunice's character, you actually had this in mind, that you're putting your character through this ordeal, and when he comes out, he's pretty much a nobody to everyone.
I mean, emasculation was not a thing that I thought about. What I meant, and maybe I didn't say it well, I meant that the book is, because it takes place in prison, there are these two men at the center of it. These two main characters take up so much space that I was worried that there's not enough space for the characterization of female characters.
Right.
That was my main worry. So Eunice's mother is, somewhere in the book. Then his lover, which is the wife of his friend, she is also there. So, but again, because the book is set in prison, I could spend only so much, on like the secondary characters. So I was a little worried that I didn't do justice to them.
But
so
that does come with that sort of toxic masculinity that I think you have addressed really well in this work, like prison system itself. So
yeah, I mean, of course, and this the whole setup is the history of kind of imprisonment, connected to different forms of enforcing masculinity in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a comment from YouTube, from Miss Jafari, or Mr. Jafari, that they say, I think Ahmadi Arian himself, in quotation, should translate this work or this novel to his mother tongue, like Murakami. He has much more readers there. This is a question that it's sort of a turn from what we are discussing, which is the novel itself, but I'm going back sort of to the act of translation. Obviously, this work cannot be translated into Persian. Are you considering to translate it at any point?
I mean, it cannot be published in there, yeah. Right? So it will be censored. I mean, the guy who reads, who's like in charge of censorship in this like so-called Ministry of Culture, which is a censorship office. He will throw it away after, before getting to page 3. So there's no way of this book getting licensed to be published there. And by the way, Murakami doesn't translate himself. He writes in Japanese, and he gets translated to English. So, but I have like a kind of almost a mental block in translating myself, I realized. That I tried a couple of times to translate like one of my short stories and later one of my essays, and every time I sat down working on it, I realized I was writing it something different.
Mm.
So I'm not the best person to do that, and also my life is just, I'm so immersed in English now. I teach in English. I have like these projects, deadlines for projects to write in English, and my I don't know, like my daily conversation is all in English, that it's really hard for me to just jump back into Persian and write something. I really need time. I
Right.
need like at least a couple of months to read Persian, write Persian, practice a little bit to get back into that mindset. But it's going to be translated. So a friend of mine has accepted
Oh, great.
and yeah, it'll be published sort of underground in Iran. So hopefully next year
That's terrific.
around, yeah.
And speaking of translation, I think was it Doctorow, I think, says that you're a different person in a different language, and I completely agree with you. Like translating your own work is just such a weird task.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to come up with the exact same imagery and story and poem when you translate yourself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I don't know how people do that. Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah. So I see there, and the Republic
Yeah.
response to novel in Iran compared to here, following up on my last response, it's not, it hasn't been translated. So people in Iran really haven't read it, and not that many people in Iran, can kind of read it like a novel in English from beginning to end. So that's
your novels your work of nonfiction and fiction also are that were published in Iran at some point. Are they still available in the bookstores?
I have no idea, to be honest.
Okay.
Maybe that nonfiction book is around because I see occasionally that being sort of reviewed and talked about. But definitely that first book, that collection of stories is not. And my second book also is not, which is a short novel, which is good. I mean, these are like early work of the youth. I'm perfectly happy to see them, removed from the face of the earth. That's perfectly fine with me. But maybe the last two books are around somewhere.
Okay, so there's another question. We didn't really get to talk about the interrogator's character, Haj Said, which I think is the most fascinating, even more fascinating, I would say, than the central character in the work, Eunice, with whom obviously everyone, to a certain extent, sort of, empathize and relate. But Haj Said has such a twisted and complicated and manipulative character. Someone has asked if Haj Said character an allusion of Said Imami, who, if you want to explain.
No, I mean he's not. Said Imami. Yeah, I don't really know much about how he was in interrogation room. No, it's just a name.
Right. Yeah. And did you so how did you come up with the character of Haj Said? Was this something that your interviewees gave you, like detailed characterization of their interrogators?
Yeah, that also a lot of it came from people whom I talked to. Actually, the reason it's called Haj Said is that maybe the interrogator that I borrowed a lot from in one of those accounts was named Haj Said too. So that maybe
okay, very interesting.
I just stole that name, but it doesn't matter. I mean, these are all pseudonyms and like surnames, and no one works there with their real name.
Yeah, and he's more like a ruthless bureaucrat than.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's what I learned from these interviews. That these are the interrogators, especially these like older, more professional ones, are not ideological in the strict sense of the word at all. They're doing their jobs. There's like a protocol they follow, and every step is almost predetermined. I mean, they have room for maneuver, but it's not as large as you would think. So yeah, that's I wanted to kind of show that this is basically like a human being in a kind of a adult sort of twisted world doing his job. I don't know how at all. I'll never be able to look at this as my job, but apparently some people can. Um, so yeah, that was like the kind of the foundation of that character for me was that, like, a bureaucrat who does his job, was, like, was responsible, was got a report to his superior. That's part of his job, and if he gets to make Eunice confess, that's good for his career too, right? Because he brags about the number of people he has interrogated, and number of cases he has won and proved, and so on. So you can see him in a sort of almost like a corporate figure, someone who's driven by success, kind of greedy for promotion, stuff like that.
He also actually kind of reminds me of the SS Nazi officers who, like, are very much just there because that's basically the option that they had during that time. Paid well, they kind of integrated into the system. That sort of banality of evil that Hannah Arendt is talking about. And you see,
they're like mid-level Nazi officers. Yeah, very much. There's a lot of similarities. Yeah.
We have another question from Jessica, who asks, you mentioned that it would be impossible to imagine solitary without experiencing it. Are there other identities, experiences you have found difficult to imagine your way into?
In this book, probably not really. And the interrogator was much easier than to imagine, like, the character of interrogator and the atmosphere of interrogation room. It was much easier because I had a lot of facts, and I had like a similar experience as myself. And the rest of it is, it's just outside in the city. It's like a bus driver. I kind of moved around Tehran on buses for, like, I don't know, 15 years. So I know that work pretty well. Also, I used to talk a lot to bus drivers when I was just, they're kind of traveling. For some reason, I always got stuck in front of the bus standing up. So I spent a lot of time talking to bus drivers back there. And no, that solitary was the most difficult part. And it's not difficult, it's impossible. Like, if I hadn't gotten to talk to the people who were there, and if they hadn't talked about it, I would never have been able to write it.
Right. Great. So we have 2 minutes, Amir, and at the end of the event, I wanted to ask you, where are you now in terms of what are you working on, and do you have any other plans coming up for Then Fish Swallowed Him?
I'm writing a novel, which I've been writing for 10 years, but it's finally coming together, and I'm hoping to finish it maybe next summer. That's kind of the timeline that I have in mind. It's a pretty long one. It's probably twice the size of this book, and it also spans kind of fairly long period of time from the dawn of 79 revolution to about 2007. So it's like the first 25 years of post-revolutionary Iran, the first 25 years. And it's the story of two friends that kind of grew up in Ahvaz, south of Iran, and moved to Tehran. And one of them becomes a journalist, the other one becomes like a computer scientist. And there are lots of elements to that. I still don't know how to even summarize it yet. So I've been working on that book for a long time, and I'm kind of doing like the hopefully last rewriting, and then start editing. Hopefully I'll get it ready next summer.
Wonderful. For those of you who haven't read the book with this beautiful cover, really, I love it. You can purchase your copy after the event. And really, this was such a pleasure. Amir, thank you to agree to talk to me about this novel and your experience of writing it. It's a truly fascinating and invaluable contribution to the Persian literature also, I think, because if we sort of agree on the fact that Persian literature isn't only get written in Persian, then I think this is very much part of that tradition also. So the more questions are coming up, we can still, okay, so
yeah, apparently
people
there
from
are a couple
Iran
of them.
say that they can still read your work, خوشبختانه, unfortunately. And another comment, the Iranian Studies Collective only caught the last few minutes, but
Just a thank you note.
Yeah,
Thank you
well,
for
everyone
coming on.
for tuning in. This was a pleasure, and thank you, Amir, for making the time to talk to me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a really good discussion, and yeah, to people who organized this, I really appreciate it. And
Yes,
thanks for everyone.
Kenny Writers House, many things would have been impossible, and this was one of them. I'm really grateful to the Kelly Writers House for hosting this event and for sponsoring this event. And I wish you all the best, Amir, with the new project you have in hand. And
Thank you very much. I need it. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Okay.
All right.
Goodbye.
So, bye, everyone.
Bye.